They've been holding that threat of genocide over everybody's head. And to be
Mhm.
able to threaten that is how they got compliance. And now they have that, now they've done it. And so the question is like, if they've done it, are we now more afraid because we know what it looks like and we're looking around and we're saying, look at what they did and what they were able to do? Or, as people in Gaza are saying, um, some people, the resistance people, are saying, look, they've done it and we're still here. They've done it.
Mhm.
They've done their absolute worst. And Hamas is still standing. They're still in charge. The resistance still has their weapons. They didn't compromise anything.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. As we try to make sense of the last 15 months of genocide in Gaza and the spillover into Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, what are the key takeaways? What does it truly mean to achieve victory in asymmetric warfare? Can military resilience withstand genocidal destruction? And how has Gaza's resistance managed to rebuild, regroup, and continue its fight against overwhelming force? Looking at the broader regional implications, why did Israel's strategy of genocide and starvation fail to eliminate Palestinian resistance in Gaza? Can it be considered a win for the resistance in spite of the apocalyptic destruction? What impact has Yemen's involvement had? And what role do Syria and Lebanon play in the shifting resistance axis? As Israel escalates its colonial expansion across Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria, what does the future of resistance look like under an increasingly messianic Israeli leadership, backed by an unpredictable US administration that supports its most extreme elements? And finally, what lessons can we draw from global South struggles against colonialism? To discuss all of this and more, I'm joined by Justin Podur, author of many books and host of the Anti-Empire Project. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Justin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Rania. I was just telling you off camera that, like, I feel like I've been spending hours and hours of time with you over the past year and a half, even though I think I've come on once or something, but like actually
Well,
talked to you once or
I've
twice.
been watching what you've been up to as well, so I feel like I've been spending a lot of time with you. It's a good way to keep up with your friends who are also hosting
Yeah,
shows.
yeah, because you can't actually talk because there's no time. But
Yeah, right.
here we are.
But now we are. Now we are.
Now
And
we are.
you've been doing some really great stuff. A few things throughout this genocide on Gaza. First, you've had this sort of program that you haven't always been on. It's been kind of like a rotating cast of people. Some of whom have been on this show before, and also
Mhm,
I've been on it before, called Tanky Therapy. That was one.
mhm.
And then you were also doing or producing, and you told me, this is wild, 167 episodes
Yeah.
of Gaza SITREP, I guess meaning Situation Report,
Yes.
um, which I think is really important to just tell our audience about, because I guess you can explain what those things are, but what motivated you to start the Gaza Situation Report and then also the Tanky Therapy stuff. But specifically with the Situation Report, how does that differ from the sort of mainstream military
Yeah.
analysts that you were telling me before we were talking about what we were going to talk about, that you were telling me sort of like prompted you to want to do something following the military movements?
Yeah, so like I've been on your show once to talk about like Canada and once to talk about Russia and I think once to talk about the environment. And
Yes.
so like I've always
Not
been a
enough
little
times, Justin.
I've always been a little all over the place in terms of what I'm interested in and what I'm writing about and what I'm thinking about. But when October 7th, 2023 happened, um and I was very much like, I've been to Gaza. I've been reporting on this and talking about this every war since, 2005, and I wanted to contribute in some way. And so for me, it was like there's always like a propaganda associated with war. I've always spent time and energy trying to disperse or just debunk war propaganda and atrocity propaganda. So obviously, like the stories that the Israelis were putting out there to justify the genocide were a initial target of mine. But then
Mm.
as the Israelis began their ground invasion, I was I was like, I need to find out what's happening here. I need to find out, you started seeing images of the Qassam, Hamas's armed wing. The initial image of like one of these fighters with a camera, like a GoPro or whatever, like putting the grenade onto the surface of the tank and everything. And I was just like, something is going on here that is completely like different from everything that I've
Right.
ever seen before. And so I started to think like I need to understand the military situation, and the military situation in these Gaza wars, which I knew a little bit about from following them, is not comparable to the military situation that you would find in Eastern Europe, or the Russia-Ukraine war that's going on, which we've talked a little bit about, and I know you've covered a little bit. But it's just a very different, or like Vietnam, or the Latin American conflicts that I also know a little bit about. Everything is different. The terrain is different. The politics is different of one side and the other. The weapons available are different. So all of these things amounted to me feeling really lost by looking at the people who knew a lot about military affairs on our side of the fence, right? Like
Hmm.
left or anti-imperialists. So I was trying to get a sense, like a lot of the Russia people that I followed were kind of quickly pivoted to trying to help people understand Gaza. And for me, I was like, this is not doing the job. So they were kind of showing maps, and when they were showing maps of like what Israel wanted, I was like, this map is a propaganda object. This is what Israel wants you to see. Israel wants you to see an image of them. Like when you think about a map, implicit to a map is that you're looking down at the world, and that's like the Israeli imperialist view, is like we're looking down at the world and we're going to carve it up. And like I remember seeing early on one of these maps, and like this is what the Israelis are going to do. They're going to carve it up and they're going to do this and that. And that is important. That is what Israel wanted. But that's not what what Israel wants isn't always what happens. And that was like the part of the story that I felt needed to be told. So that was when I thought, okay, I need to start and educate myself to do military analysis of this conflict, and I need to start with certain theories. So if you go back and look at the early sit reps, I was looking at General Giap from Vietnam, and Mao Zedong and Che Guevara, and all of these people who had these theories of guerrilla warfare. And then you see that there are some people from the West Bank and some people, Yahya Sinwar's novel I got a lot out of, and Basil El Araj. There's this 8 notes of war or something that he wrote in a previous Gaza war. He was from the West Bank. He was killed by the Israelis, I think, or by the PA. And
Same thing.
that like little note that this pretty young pharmacy student wrote had so much insight, so much more insight into the nature of this war than so many other sources that I was consulting. That I was like, we need to kind of build up an analysis from these facts of this war. And so that was what I was trying to do with the sit reps.
And so here we are, 15 months,
Yeah.
and 167 episodes of the sit rep later.
Hmm.
And I guess, we've reached this point where there's this ceasefire in Gaza. I think there's actually, as we're speaking, there's supposed to be, if it hasn't already happened, some more of the Israeli prisoners released, as well as
Yeah.
Palestinian prisoners, who were apparently only supposed to call the Israelis hostages. And the
Yes.
Palestinians are prisoners because, one side is human and the other
Yeah.
side just isn't.
Yeah.
Um, but no, that's, I mean, that's what that's about. But all that's to say, this was framed as, once the ceasefire went into effect, by the spokesperson for the Qassam brigades, Abu Ubaidah, as a victory. And many
Mhm.
Palestinians celebrated it as a victory. And of course, I'm not trying to generalize about everybody's viewpoint,
Yeah.
but there is a sense that the resistance came out of this victorious. Now, with that said, you also see a shocking, unprecedented level of destruction. I mean, these images we've been seeing coming
Mhm.
out of Gaza from like the drones in the sky, um, that have that, view of just every single building destroyed, are
Yeah.
so shocking. You've got this one woman at the UN who was visiting saying, "We've been driving around for 10 minutes. I haven't seen a single standing structure." People are having a difficult time recognizing their neighborhoods, or even like knowing where their neighborhood starts and ends, because it's just unrecognizable. There's been a massive loss of life that hasn't even really been calculated yet. Officially, I think it's like 45,000 have been killed, recorded killed, and then at least 14,000, but that number keeps rising, believed to be under the rubble. I'm sure there's even more than that. I know that the actual estimate is like somewhere in the maybe hundreds of thousands of who died in this Holocaust on Gaza. So I raise all that destruction, just to say, as the devil's advocate here,
Yeah.
how do we define victory when we talk about this kind of asymmetric warfare in the midst of a genocide? Because to some people looking at it, they're really wondering, in light of the destruction in Gaza and also in a place like South Lebanon, can we really call this a victory? Or should we be specific about what we mean when we say it's a win and a loss for Israel?
Yes. Okay. So
It's a big
when
question.
when you study this issue, you and the kind of theorists on this issue, they'll tell you that, like, you have to understand military struggle as kind of like the top of a pyramid, and the base of the pyramid is the society, the political economy, and our global political economy, as your listeners, your viewers know better because you brought the Patnaiks on and others to talk about the nature of our global economy, is one of um, unbelievable inequality, and that political economy is based on centuries of the accumulation of wealth and power from the whole world, basically, to the West. And the West includes Israel, and people know more about what Israel is and who Israelis really are, and how they're actually all from Europe, and how they're not from the Middle East, and how they came with all of this wealth and power and these alliances and this kind of colonial background and this colonial know-how for taking land, displacing the inhabitants, the forming alliances between native tribes to destroy one another. All of these kinds of modes that the Americans did in the Americas, and that they did all over Africa and Asia. So that's what Israel is. And Israel is this society that has this enormous accumulation of colonial power. And what they're facing is a society that has been devastated, divided by them and by the West, and that has had to build whatever military ability to resist that they do have. They've had to build that under surveillance. They've had to build that under occupation. They've had to build that under periodic destruction. And
Yeah.
so when you look at that asymmetry, I just want everybody who is feeling defeatist right now. I'm not trying to tell you that this situation is great. I'm just trying to call your attention to that asymmetry. You can never forget the asymmetry between these two sides. And it's when you start to slip and forget that these sides are so asymmetric that you start to say, "Oh my God, this was a loss. Oh my God, this was terrible." And um, the 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 destruction that you're talking about is something that the Israelis had the power to do all along. If they didn't have the power to do it, they wouldn't have. You wouldn't see it. And the
Right.
fact that they always had the power to do it is the problem. and it was something they've been holding over everybody's head. They've been holding that threat of genocide over everybody's head. They've been saying, we could. Remember, you may have even seen posters like this. If we wanted to genocide, we could. And then they kind of withdrew that. It was like one of these propaganda posters that
Wow. No,
one
I
of
think
the
I missed
Israeli.
that, but Jesus.
It was like
Okay.
white writing on a pink background, and it was like, "Honey, if we wanted to do genocide, we would," or something. And, and then they withdrew that. They
Okay.
withdrew that ad, but good move to
Yeah.
withdraw it.
Wow, guys. Really
But
smart
that was
propaganda.
always that was always their the threat, right? And to be
Hmm.
able to threaten that is how they got compliance. To be able to project this image of invincibility is everything that they want. And that is, to quote the commander from Beit Hanun, right? There was a commander that they announced was dead, and he came out and he said this little spiel that I'm going to read because I think it's really important in terms of an answer to that hopelessness. Because he said, battles are about achieving goals. If you don't achieve your goals, you have lost. As we say in military and civilian terms, the strong, if he is not victorious, then he is defeated, while the weak, if he is not defeated, then he is victorious. So that's an admission too that this is the asymmetry. Like, that is a speech of somebody who understands the asymmetry here. We're the weak. We were not defeated, so we're victorious. They're the strong. They did not have victory, so they have lost. And so when you specifically asked, how can we call this a victory? And that's how one can call it a victory. um
Yeah, I mean, it's important just to add to that. I mean, it is important to note that Israel went into this saying they wanted the elimination of Hamas. And
exactly.
what happened as soon as that ceasefire went into effect is you had Hamas guys coming out in clean clothes,
Yep.
like with weapons, having a parade. That is the opposite. And you see the Israeli reaction to that. They were like, wait, what? Like,
Yeah.
we threw everything we had at you, and you're
Yeah.
still there, and you've still got like the hostages, the prisoners, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, they're clean too. And
Yeah.
it's
They
just,
have
I mean,
gift
the
they gave them
psychological
gift
impact on the
bags,
Israel. Yeah, they got gift
goodie
bags, right?
bags.
Yeah, people
Do you
online
know
were
what was
like,
in the goodie bags? I never followed that up. Do you? It was
I
probably
think there
just
was like a
sweets.
map of Palestine or something, and like I don't know, probably like a suite, who knows? But all that's to say, like they're so hospitable, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's Palestinian culture, but I think it is important to recognize that Israel, had these big military aims, and by declaring these huge aims, just the mere fact of being still standing at the end of it is actually a loss for the Israelis. And there's to a certain degree that was the case with Hezbollah in Lebanon as well. I mean, Israel never went in with the intention or saying that they intended to completely eliminate Hezbollah. That was never, they didn't say it like that, was not the declaration like with Gaza. Um, but the Israelis did have bigger ambitions in Lebanon that they couldn't achieve and ultimately had to leave because they couldn't win on the ground. But I do want to challenge you on this, just because this is what a lot of people are saying. So I think it's important
Yeah.
to engage with the criticisms, or maybe not the criticisms, but the other views on this. And that is, how do you respond to those who would argue that Israel's territorial gains, in addition to the like not in addition to the destruction of infrastructure, that the territorial gains, whether we're talking about being able to implement a kind of buffer zone in Lebanon, and I mean, I'm not trying to necessarily bring Syria into this yet. We're going to get to that, but they did take territory in Syria. They were pushed out of Gaza because they had to agree to a ceasefire, but they planned to take territory in Gaza, and there's still extreme elements that plan too. We see what they're doing in the West Bank. It's kind of in its most messianic and expansionist period in Israeli history at this moment in time. So, to those who would say, "Oh, but look at the territorial gains that outweighs, still standing at the end, or any perceived Palestinian successes," how would you respond to that?
Okay, let me make one more point about infrastructure before we do that, because
Yeah, sure.
as an environmental person, you know, I'm steeped in literature about like how the earth is going to become uninhabitable and how like we're headed for dystopia, etc. And like there's all this environmentalist dystopia stuff. And so, but like one thing that I got watching this war that I had never thought of before was how actively dystopia actually has to be maintained. So the Israelis had this, I would almost call it pathological, driven need to go and redestroy the hospitals that they destroyed. Every time they would destroy a hospital and leave, and they'd take the footage of themselves partying in the destroyed hospital, and then they'd take off, the Palestinians would go back and get it running again. And then the Israelis would go back and destroy it again. And so and that happened 3 or 4 times with some hospitals in
Yeah.
over the year and a half. And so and then the Palestinians were like, fine, we'll do hospitals in tents, we'll do clinics in tents. They the Israelis had to maintain, like, it takes work, it takes money, it takes billions of dollars in transfers from America to maintain Palestine in a dystopian state. So in a sense, a ceasefire is the begin, like, as soon as you stop destroying Gaza, the Palestinians start making it habitable again. So like I just want to emphasize the point of like how much work it actually takes to make a dystopia and keep a dystopia going. And Israel
Yeah,
is devoted to that now. That's Israel's whole mission, and that's like the whole Western mission now, is maintaining a dystopia in for the
that to
Palestinians.
maintain that destruction of basically everything that sustains life
Yeah,
takes a lot of work. It's not it takes actually the entire billions and billions of dollars by the
yeah.
entire Western world, basically.
Ongoing
Uh,
work. It's not
yeah,
one and done. Okay,
yeah,
so now
yeah.
territorial gains. So the territorial issue is interesting because I don't think Israel took territory in Syria. Israel was given territory in Syria. And
Uh,
it was basically given the territory by this regime that was installed by Turkey. Basically, like, it was a gift. Nobody was fighting them. And so that territory was given to them. The buffer zone in Lebanon was given to them. That was the cease. It was not, they didn't take that territory during the war. They took the territory during the ceasefire. And
yeah,
so that it is much more, again, if you watch the military dimension along with the political and diplomatic dimensions, Israel is gaining right now from um, everything but military conflict. It is the
huh,
disorder and division in their neighboring countries, specifically Lebanon and Syria, that they're gaining from. And if they could make if they could have made that happen in Egypt, if they could have made that happen in Jordan, if they could have made that happen, of course, in Gaza. I mean, that's their dream. That would have been real. They would have experienced real success. And a lot of the success they're having in the West Bank right now is also because of their agreement with the Palestinian Authority. It's because of that, things that are being given to them, not things that they're taking. The whole
yeah,
situation in Jenin, for example, is this situation where the Palestinian resistance is in this kind of conflict with the Palestinian Authority that has this contract with Israel. And the Palestinian resistance is very patient, right? Like, it's this extreme patience that's frustrating to watch from the outside, because they don't want to have a civil war, and because they know that gives Israel what they want, but that means just continuously taking blows from the Palestinian Authority on behalf of the Israelis. So these things are really difficult to navigate politically and militarily, because but the none of this amounts to a military victory for Israel. And it one shouldn't overestimate. It's important not to underestimate, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that. It's important not to ever underestimate Israel or what they can do. But it's also important not to get psyched out and think that they are winning militarily, when you look at what they've accomplished militarily. Most of what they've gotten has been handed to them, either handed to them
yeah.
by prospective enemies, or, I mean, you could say it's been handed to them by previous generations of the Israeli army. Like, the 1967 Israeli army is not the Israeli army of today.
It's interesting. I was watching the episode you did after it was on basically the post colonial history of Syria.
Mhm.
Super interesting. I highly recommend people go check it out. It's like basically 1945 to 2011, and a lot of it is very deja vu. But something that you said was that. The West's ability to get Arab leaders to work on their behalf has been far more successful at giving them the outcomes they want than Western firepower.
Yeah.
So when you mention things like the Palestinian Authority, or even when we talk about like Egypt or Jordan normalizing with the Israelis, ultimately, or the people in Lebanon who are pro America
Yeah.
and want to ultimately normalize with Israel, or having this new regime in Syria, which is signaling repeatedly that they are on board to eventually normalize with Israel, at least not fight them ever. Um, it definitely speaks to all that. But before we get to some more of that stuff, I did want to
Mhm.
ask you about something that you mentioned to me when we were talking about what we were going to discuss. And you had mentioned that Gaza won without committing mass atrocities or mass
Yeah.
civilian casualties, um, demonstrating that that's not necessary to do. The same thing could be said with Lebanon, too, in terms of like
Yeah.
not committing mass civilian mass atrocities or mass civilian casualties. And there was even people in Lebanon who were upset that that Hezbollah like wasn't
Yeah.
hitting Israeli population centers. Can you elaborate on what this says about, I guess, the nature of a victory in modern asymmetric warfare?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And it, again, war propaganda in this war and the nature of Western media being just utterly hopelessly devoted to Israel means that this conversation, we can't have this conversation, right? You can't say you can't say Israel committed atrocities even when they're right in front of you. And you can't say Hamas didn't commit atrocities because that's all we've ever heard, even though there's no evidence of them. But like, if you've watched the war, you watch medical evacuation, medevac helicopters, which are under complete surveillance by Hamas fighters, and the helicopters land and they pick up their wounded and they fly away, and that's happened dozens or hundreds of times during this war, and Hamas doesn't target those helicopters. They don't hit medevac. They haven't hit any medevac helicopters. I mean, Hezbollah did, but like, they must have a different religious ruling on that issue. The Israelis do, right? The Israelis go and destroy hospitals very specifically in a very, like, that's their target. They don't want to fight uh, the resistance. They want to go and attack the hospital. If they could avoid any fighting with any armed group and just go straight to the hospital, they would. And they did that over and over again. They were very unpleasantly surprised that there was actually resistance fighting them. So um, I think that a lot of warfare is psychological warfare. And a lot of what Israel does is psychological warfare. And it's psychological warfare on all fronts. It's against the Western public, it's against the Israeli public, it's against the Palestinians. Everybody gets their own specific propaganda strategy. And one of the main points that they want you to believe is not just like, it's not just that we're invincible. It's not just that we know everything that you're going to do before you're going to do it. It's not just that we have people inside your organizations working for you. It's also that we are so evil. We are capable of doing such evil stuff that you have to be crazy to oppose us, right? And that is like, they don't, again, honey, we would do genocide if we wanted to. Like, all there's a lot of subtle ways of getting into that without admitting that. But like, a lot of what they're doing, where they're playing with the kids' toys and they're that they've killed, or they're wearing the women's underwear that they've killed, like, all of that stuff is to show, like, madman theory, like, we're crazy, we're evil, we're so evil, you don't want to mess with us, right? We're psychopaths. And um and it would be so easy, and like you said, like, the human impulse for revenge it's real. And so, like, the only thing that, in my view, restrains the Palestinian resistance or Hezbollah from fighting back and paying them back in their own coin is that they have these kind of religious beliefs. And when you have Marxist guerrillas, they have these really strong like ideological framework. But if you have an and you actually have to have an ideological framework to have a guerrilla movement. People have to buy in to something that is more important than their lives and then things like revenge. And so that is for me that was a really important lesson, was like, no matter how evil and no matter how openly evil and no matter how much evil was a strategy of Israel's, the guerrilla forces, the resistance forces, never responded in the same way. And that's exactly what you said. Like, people, I watched online and I heard a lot of people including from Lebanon or Syria, saying, we need to do this. The resistance needs to do the same thing. The Israelis are only gonna, they're only gonna get it when their population centers start getting hit. And it just they I the resistance strategy was based on patience. It was based on absorbing more damage than the Israelis can inflict, and not based on becoming what the Israelis are. And I think that also speaks to a really long view that the resistance has of what kind of society they want to be and what kind of society they want to become and what kind of people they want to be before their higher power, etc. And the Israelis have shown no regard for that. They've shown no regard for what kind of society they have become.
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer-supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us. No, every accusation is a confession when it comes to Israel. That is what we learned over these last 15 months. So I want to ask you about the opening up of multiple fronts, because that was something that was quite unprecedented with this war. Which is, you had Lebanon opening up a support front under Hezbollah. You had the Iraqis every so often firing at the Israelis. There was groups there that opened up a support front. I think the most significant one was Yemen, that has really demonstrated it's much more powerful than any of us had thought it could be, especially after suffering so much itself. With what they were doing in the Red Sea, as well as firing missiles at the Israelis from very far away. And then, as far as like hot wars, that was quite a field that Israel had to deal with. And of course, Israel's whole idea of dealing with all these fronts was to decouple them, to separate them. And at some point, I don't think it's fair to say that they decoupled the fronts so much as, and this has become a big topic of debate here in Lebanon, or it was once the ceasefire in Lebanon was announced. But it was more like Lebanon became a full-on front in its own right. And that's what it stopped being a support front and became a war front. And that's why that ceasefire was agreed to, because it couldn't be a support front anymore. But that's how I see it, at least. But all that's to say, what do you make of the axis of resistance strategy of opening those multiple fronts? How effective was Israel in countering those fronts? And then there was that Syria factor, which never opened up as a front. And a lot of the resistance axis was very upset and made it pretty clear after Assad was deposed that they requested several times Syria open up that front. And Assad said no, but Syria is a sovereign country and he has the right to say no. But it was seen as a bit of a betrayal.
Yeah. In retrospect, it's hard to imagine how opening the front would have made Syria's situation worse.
Right. I mean, by
right?
opening the front, I mean, basically Hezbollah wanted to fire from the Golan, basically, like,
Yeah,
after
yeah,
Israel.
but
They had a lot of weapons and assets there that now they no longer have, but yeah.
yeah. I mean, they didn't use them while they had them, and now they're
Yeah.
not, they don't. So, yeah, I mean, I think that argument is valid. I think that from a strictly military perspective, Syria holding that back was detrimental. I don't think it's possible to argue otherwise.
Mhm.
Now, the Yemen is, I think, really, really interesting because they um, have proven unbeatable, and that's like because no matter even though they're so far away, like you said, and they were begging for a land route, and they're still. If you watch Abdel Malik Al Houthi's speeches on Thursdays, he's just like, we wanted to go, we had 500,000 men ready to go, but nobody would open us our land route. And so like they're thoughtful, they're thinking about the next rounds, and they're thinking about how they're going to get there, and that's important. And I think
Yeah.
Israel has to think about that too, because they wanted the Americans to go and destroy Ansar Allah for them, and the Americans tried and they couldn't. And so and they tried for 7 or 8, 9 years before that with using the Saudis, and they couldn't then either. So Yemen is still there, and that's a major strategic factor. How did Yemen prove unbeatable? And this is important because, again, if you watched Yemen really closely over the past year and a half, every once in a while there would be this announcement that made very little sense and had very little context, but they would say something like, we foiled an entire cell, we've unraveled an entire network of traders. And you'd be like, well, that's weird, I never. And then you would hear nothing else about it. But it was very clear to me that there was every attempt to kind of do coup and overthrow Ansar Allah from the inside, do pager attack type things. Like, all of those things are there, and Yemen just happen to have the abilities and the capacities to defeat and foil all of those. And intelligence operations that are foiled they're nothing to look at. It's not like a missile that lands, right? It's not like the Palestine 2 missile landing in Tel Aviv. It's like a little announcement. But those announcements, I think, were really significant. So we've covered Syria, Yemen. Now, Hezbollah, I think, some things work out and some things don't work out. And I think that the concept of a support front was a very dangerous concept, right? They were trying to walk the edge between, like, we're going to um we're going to we're going to support Gaza, we're going to draw Israeli troops away from Gaza, we're going to destroy all this surveillance and intelligence equipment uh, that is designed to facilitate the invasion of Lebanon. So it was taking advantage of the Gaza situation too, I think, to do
Yeah.
that. Um, but but we're gonna somehow keep it short of Israel invading, because Israel doesn't have an interest in invading, because Israel should know that if they invade, they can't actually successfully invade or occupy Lebanon. And that proved to be true. So like we have to understand, like, some of the assumptions here proved to be incorrect, but some of them proved to be correct. And so leading up to the invasion of Lebanon, on the sitrep, we had some discussions where it was like it would be irrational for Israel to invade because they cannot win this war. And they did invade, and it did prove to be irrational in a lot of ways. But then the ceasefire enabled them to sneak in there, and we'll have to see what happens next. But
Yeah.
again, with Hezbollah, with Lebanon, the greatest things that Israel had going for them were not the ability to win militarily. The greatest things they had going for them were the fact that they have lots of people in Lebanon working for them. They have lots of factions. They have the American embassy, which is now going to be what, the size of Beirut or something.
Second biggest
Uh,
embassy in the world or something.
the biggest embassy in the world with 15,000 people working there. You don't
It's fine, Justin. It's just an embassy. Like, chill out. It's
just
fine.
embassy, right? Yeah, they're just
A
processing
country the
visas.
size of Connecticut like has needs to have a massive embassy. It's totally fine.
So again, like I think it's that same thing from Syrian history, which is the ability to, as the so one English imperialist wrote back in the day, get into the skin of subject peoples. That's the most powerful ability that the colonizers have. And if there is unity among the colonized, that's when there's a revolt. That's when there's a resort to overwhelming firepower, which is horrible to watch and horrible to contemplate, but doesn't actually win or allow them to impose their will on the people that they're attacking.
So I think that I want to ask you about this before I kind of like lay out some of the lessons that you wanted to discuss as well. I wanted to
Hmm.
ask you about the fact that genocide and starvation can't win a war. That's how you put it.
Hmm. Yeah,
That Israel thought you could just, skip over military victory,
yeah,
kill civilians, destroy the infrastructure, starve everyone. But
yeah.
that's that one of the takeaways, among many others from the last 15 months, is that genocide and starvation can't win a war. I think that's just it's worth repeating, but
Hmm.
also other lessons. And I'm just going to list a couple, and I want you to just kind of take on what you want because I think these are all
Okay.
really important lessons to like absorb. That's one. That having the whole West on your side isn't enough anymore. Because
Yeah.
Israel, like you mentioned earlier with the asymmetry of this, had the entire West, all of Europe, all of the US, all of the Five Eyes nations. So you got Japan, and actually, even with the Japanese, they weren't really for Israel on this, but like Australia, Canada, all these countries were backing the Israelis. Everybody was giving Israel money. Everybody was, giving Israel the diplomatic cover. I mean, the most, Germany, the most important of this, though, was coming from the US. And it
Hmm.
still was not enough. So I guess that those two kind of go together, in my opinion.
Yeah.
What's the significance of those two lessons that genocide and starvation can't win a war? And that having the entire force of the Western world, the most powerful empire in history, backing you is also, in this case, not enough.
Yeah, I mean, that was for me the whole question for the year and a half was like, can they pull this off? Like, and I think that they wanted nobody knew. I think they genuinely thought maybe they could do it. And there were moments, right, when they were internally displacing people from the north where it was like, "Oh my god, maybe they can pull this off. Maybe they can pull this off." But um that was while they were doing that, they were exhausting their own military. And while they were doing that, they were setting themselves up for some of the biggest um ambushes, some of the biggest like mass casualty events that the Israeli army suffered, right? In Beit Hanun, like there was like a couple of weeks ago where it was almost supernatural what we were seeing. It was like, how did they get the you would see a report that the resistance killed like 25 Israelis in one attack. And I had never seen those kinds of numbers in the entire war. And it was like, this is happening really late. Like I thought like who's getting worn out here? Why how are the Israelis walking into these situations 18, whatever, 16 months into the war? So it was, yeah, like you still need to occupy territory. You still need ground troops, human beings in boots standing in a place that are vulnerable to getting shot and blown up like, pieces of meat.
Mm-hmm.
You still need those pieces of meat deployed all over a place if you want to actually control it. And so that is um I didn't know that. Like I was genuinely not sure about that during this war. And then when the ceasefire came, I was like, wow, they couldn't pull it off. They tried genocide and starvation and siege, and they couldn't do it. And when you look at the West Bank, when you look at what's happening there, it's also like a devolution of what the Israelis used to do. The Israelis, if you followed the history of the way Israel colonized the West Bank after 1967. They would take these hilltops, they would they would fortify, and they would start to displace the people, and they would start to get their civilians in, and then the next military outpost would be to protect these settlements. And that's not what's happening anymore. What's happening now is they're going and they're raiding, they're killing people, and then they're withdrawing. And it's always
Hmm.
like a day or 2 days. They do it a lot. They do it almost every other day, but they don't stay. They're not staying. They're not occupying. And they can't seem to do that anymore. And that is,
That's a really good point.
yeah. So it's raids, right? It's raids. And like, when you talk about Syria and their territorial gains in Syria, like whatever is happening in Syria is just beginning. It is just beginning.
It's also, I mean, a way it should be understood too that like Syria, the areas that the Israelis have invaded further into the Golan and Syria
Mhm.
are more rural areas. They're not
Yeah.
like densely populated,
Mhm.
so there's not as many people to even put up a fight as you would
Yeah.
have in like Jenin refugee camp or in
Right.
any part of Gaza, really. So it's just like a different ball game altogether.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that Syrians aren't going to do anything about it eventually. I also want to ask you about a few other lessons, like one that you pointed out
Mhm.
to me that I think is important that we've been
Mhm.
contending with here in the region is that there's nothing so bad that it will cause a revolution in
Oh, yeah.
Egypt or Jordan. And I want to be fair to Egyptians and Jordanians. I mean, the Egyptian and Jordanian public obviously are very pro Palestine.
Yeah.
Um, I think a lot of Egyptians would love to go fight the Israelis,
Yeah.
but these are countries that are so repressive and just under the boot and control of these US backed police states that
Yeah.
are just, it's like they're omnipresent in a way
Yeah.
that I don't think we can really fathom. And especially with the case of Egypt, I mean, after the Egyptian revolution in the 2011 days and what came after it under Sisi, like every organization has been crushed and
Mhm.
dismembered, and people have been jailed, and there's just no organizing capacity in
Yeah.
Egypt. There's also, but I just, yeah, I think that's an important thing. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I just thought it's important to point
Yeah,
that
I
out.
want to add a couple things because I read a lot. I did a deep dive, as the kids say, into Egyptian military history and the 1967 and 73 wars. And looking at that, it's fascinating because the Egyptian state is fundamentally about um, having coups and preventing coups. It's
Hmm.
about like what's going on internally inside the Egyptian military. Everybody at the top of that regime is worried about somebody else from that regime taking over from them. And that's
That's a
like,
special kind of paranoia.
yeah, that's a special kind of paranoia, but like how secondary Israel is in all of this, even when they're in an absolute shooting war with Israel, like even in 73 or 67 or in between during the war of attrition after the fundamental concern of the elite at the top, the ruling class of Egypt is just like not getting overthrown by other factions of the ruling class in Egypt. And so that um that just it just makes it a really tough nut to crack in terms of if you're on the street, the so-called Arab street, and you're trying to affect global events. It's just there's no way to there's just no mechanism to do that. And so that was another open question, right? What's the role of the Arab street, like in Western terms? And it's like the role of the Arab street does not seem to be all that strong. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, no, that's it. That's important to understand moving forward.
yeah,
And then also you made this point about how the Israelis, and you kind of touched on this before, but the Israelis, they make a lot of claims about things that just never
yes,
happen, but that then happen. And
yeah,
then, like we're never going to accept a Hamas government, but then we're
yeah,
going to, destroy Hamas. We're never going to leave Gaza. And then, you see how things end up turning out. So basically, I think that goes back to what you were saying. It's like just because the Israelis say it
yes.
and want it does not make it so.
Yeah, and it's like
Yeah.
the propaganda, that is a propaganda object, right? The prediction of what's going to happen, or the statement like the Israelis will never accept this. Um that's like, Yeah, they will. It's just the circumstances of, it's just you haven't found the circumstances under which they'll accept it. But like,
Well, and
uh,
then yeah, exactly. And then we also learned, I think, during these 15 months that of genocide, that when it comes to Western-backed colonialism or
mhm,
imperialism, international law doesn't stop it. The Security
yeah,
Council certainly doesn't stop it. Thank you, America. The
mhm,
anti-war movement, as important as it is, and it should continue, don't stop being in the streets,
yeah,
but was not able to stop it, right?
yeah,
What was able to put a pause to it at least, and I
mhm,
think the answer to that is the armed resistance. Like, if we
exactly,
learned anything from this, it's
yeah,
that armed resistance is actually quite necessary uh,
yeah,
for any liberation struggle against what's the most depraved imperial empire in the history of the world. And from there, I wanted to go to kind of back to a little bit of what we started with, but to get a little bit more specific. And that's, why did the resistance succeed?